Something unexpected happened at a live event, and for a brief moment, everything carefully controlled, everything perfectly managed, simply slipped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it didn't come with any grand gesture that demanded attention. But somehow, it became the only thing anyone could talk about. A single look, so natural, so unfiltered, that it felt almost out of place in a world where every expression is usually measured and intentional. And yet, that's exactly why it mattered. What people saw wasn't just a glance exchanged between two celebrities sharing the same space. It wasn't the kind of polite acknowledgement that happens all the time in public events, where smiles are rehearsed and reactions are anticipated. This was different. It carried something deeper, something that didn't belong to the cameras or the audience. It felt like a moment that wasn't meant to be seen, and maybe that's why it hit so hard when it was. For someone known for composure, for maintaining a level of control that has defined her public image for years, this moment stood out immediately. She has spent decades perfecting the balance between being warm and being private, between engaging with the world and keeping certain parts of herself untouched by it. That balance rarely breaks. In fact, it almost never does. Which is why when it did, even for a second, it didn't go unnoticed. The setting itself wasn't unusual. A live event, filled with energy, cameras capturing every angle, people watching closely, both in the room and from behind screens. These are the kinds of environments where every movement is subtly calculated, where even spontaneity has limits. And yet, something about this particular moment bypassed all of that. It didn't wait for permission. It didn't stay within boundaries. It simply happened. The look came quietly. There was no build-up, no obvious signal that something significant was about to unfold. But when it did, it carried layers that people immediately began to unpack. The first thing that stood out was recognition, not the kind that comes from seeing someone across a room, but the kind that comes from understanding something unspoken. It was the kind of recognition that suggests a shared language, something private, something that exists beyond what others can see. And then there was the softness. Not the general warmth that people display in public settings, but something more focused, more personal. It wasn't spread across the room. It wasn't meant for everyone. It was directed, precise, almost as if the rest of the world had briefly faded into the background. That's what made it feel so real. It didn't perform for the audience. It ignored them. But what truly defined the moment was the ease. There was no hesitation, no awareness interrupting it. It was the kind of ease that only exists when someone feels completely at home in the presence of another person. No effort, no adjustment, no need to hold anything back. And that's the part that people couldn't stop thinking about. Because ease like that doesn't appear out of nowhere. It comes from something built over time, something steady and deeply rooted. Those who have followed their story closely didn't see this as an isolated incident. Instead, they saw it as a continuation, a piece of a larger pattern that has been forming quietly over the years. Small moments, subtle reactions, things that could easily be overlooked on their own. But together, they start to tell a story. A story that doesn't rely on announcements or confirmations, but reveals itself in fragments. What made this moment even more compelling was what seemed to trigger it. There was no grand display, no obvious action that would explain such a reaction. Instead, it appeared to be something small, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. And that's what made it so powerful, because the most meaningful things often are. It suggested the presence of something deeper, a kind of communication that doesn't need to be understood by everyone else to be meaningful. A private exchange, hidden in plain sight. Something that only makes sense to the people involved, while the rest of the world is left trying to interpret its impact. And then came the shift, because he noticed. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where everything seemed to pause. Not in a dramatic, performative way, but in a way that felt genuine. As if he needed just a second to take it in, to process what had just been given to him in that look. It wasn't something he expected, at least not in that setting. And for that fraction of a second, the environment around them seemed to lose its importance. His reaction didn't overpower the moment. It matched it. There was a quiet acknowledgement, a reflection of the same feeling, the same understanding. And just like that, the exchange was complete. No words, no gestures, nothing that could be easily pointed to. But something had clearly passed between them. The audience, even without fully understanding what they had witnessed, felt it. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the kind that happens when something real cuts through the usual flow of events. People might not have been able to explain it, but they could sense that something had changed, even if only for a few seconds, and then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The moment closed, the composure returned, and everything went back to normal. But not really. Because once something like that is seen, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It gets replayed, analyzed, discussed. And that's exactly what happened. Clips started circulating, slowed down, zoomed in, examined from every possible angle. People began breaking it apart, trying to understand what made it feel so different. And while interpretations varied, one thing remained consistent. Everyone agreed that it wasn't ordinary. It became more than just a moment. It became confirmation. Not in a loud, undeniable way, but in a quiet, deeply convincing one. The kind that doesn't need to be announced to be believed. The kind that feels true because of how naturally it appeared. What people connected with wasn't just the idea of a relationship. It was the authenticity of it. The fact that it showed itself without intention, without performance. In a world where so much is curated and controlled, something unfiltered stands out immediately. And maybe that's why it resonated so strongly. Because it reminded people of something real. Something simple, yet powerful. The way a single look can carry more meaning than 1,000 words. The way genuine emotion doesn't need to be explained to be understood. As the discussions continued, one question kept coming up. What did it mean? Not just in the context of that moment, but in the bigger picture. And while there may not be a single answer, the implications are hard to ignore. It suggests a level of connection that goes beyond what is usually visible. A kind of understanding that doesn't rely on constant expression, but reveals itself in moments like this. Moments that aren't planned, that don't follow a script, that simply happen because they can't be held back. And maybe that's the most compelling part of all. Not the look itself, but what it represents. The idea that beneath all the layers of control and professionalism, there is something steady and real. Something that doesn't need to prove itself, because it shows up exactly when it matters. For those who witnessed it, whether in real time or through a screen, it became more than just content. It became a feeling, something that stayed with them, something that made them pause and reflect. Because moments like this don't just entertain, they connect. And as the conversation continues, as more people discover and analyze that brief exchange, one thing becomes clear. It wasn't just about what was seen. It was about what was felt. And sometimes that makes all the difference. So now the question turns to you. When you watched that moment, what stood out the most? Was it the recognition, the softness, the ease, or the quiet response that followed? Because everyone sees something slightly different, but somehow it all leads to the same conclusion. Something real happened, even if only for a second. And that second was enough to say everything.